Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Whip Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to capture two towns in the Sumy region in the northern section of the border area. The Russians also managed to advance within the town of Vovchansk, gaining control over the aggregate plant and advancing within the northern parts of the Vovchansk river line. The Russians managed to advance west of Grigorivka, north of Chasiv Yar, gaining control over the first patch along the Canal. The Russians also managed to advance to the north of Toretsk along the Canal, with additional advances along the area between Toretsk and Pokrovsk, where the Russians continue closing the pocket by storming it head-on, leaving a gap for the Ukrainians to withdraw through under heavy fire by the Russians on both flanks. The Russians also managed to advance to the northeast of Pokrovsk, gaining control over additional forest lines and fields, reaching the outskirts of the next settlement in line northwest of the highway between Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka, and the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Zelenopole in the southern parts of the Donetsk region. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Zelenopole. The Ukrainian forces that were operationally encircled within the western parts of the town, the Russians now have full control of it, as we see with the shield-kitted footage, confirming full Russian control over the town with Russian positions in the northwestern parts of it. With Zelenopole under Russian control, the Russians can expand their offensive operations to the south to flank Novopil and advance westwards towards the Zaporizhia region. At the same time, it also opens up for further Russian offensive operations in the northern direction, in the direction of Komishovacha, as well as Shevchenko in the north. To the northeast of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over the southern flank of Rusyn Yar and advance further within Poltavka. Following the capture of Chasiv Yar, the Russian forces are focusing on the eastern flank, where they're expanding towards the next settlement by gaining control over the forest lines and fields to the south of it, opening up the roads from Poltavka to Rusyn Yar from the south. Securing these roads allow the Russians to storm Rusyn Yar from the south from two separate supply routes. At the same time, it also allows the Russians to flank Poltavka from the east, and with control over the forest lines here in the center, the Russians will be able to flank the fortified positions in the east from the western direction, isolating Rusyn Yar from the front line, with additional advances here to the northwest of Rusyn Yar, cutting them off from the western direction as well. The Russians will be able to isolate Rusyn Yar with just the northern roads under their control. The Russians flanking these fortified positions will allow them to continue their advances along the TO504 highway, where the Russians are working on advancing through Yablonivka and start the battles over the settlements here to the north of Yablonivka, such as Stepanivka and Vovchansk, which will allow the Russians to gain control over the western flank of Kostyantynivka. For the operational encirclement of the city, the Russians will need to gain control over Mykolaiv, Vovchansk and Stepanivka in the western flank, the towns of Vyrolyubivka, Popasny, Stinky, and Mykolaivka in the northern flank, as well as Ivanopilia and Predeshine in the eastern flank. Gain control over these settlements, the Russians are now moving through the northern flank of the TO504 highway, as well as directly through it to reach the southern part of these settlements, which is Stepanivka. Gain control over Stepanivka, the Russians need to gain control over the fortified positions here to the southwest of the town. If the Russians gain control over Chasiv Yar, they will be able to advance in the northeastern direction towards Vovchansk, bypassing the fortified positions from the north. And by gaining control over Yablonivka, the Russians will be able to flank it from the south. The Russians have managed to secure additional parts of the pocket that was formed to the north of Stara Mykolaivka. With full control over the town, the Russians are moving alongside the pocket, storming the Ukrainian positions head-on to force a retreat, which will be struck by the Russian forces within Romanivka and Surya. The Russians almost have full control of the area, allying the front line to the north, where the Russians will start offensive operations towards Oleksandro-Kalinove, Yablonivka, as well as Katerinivka and Sherbinivka in the east. In the northern flank of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to gain control of additional forest lines along the canal. The Russians are here looking to secure the western flank of Gordyimivka to gain control of additional crossings across the canal and continue offensive operations towards Bilahora and Dilivka. The Russians are working here to secure the eastern flank of the Ukrainian positions to the north of the city to allow for additional offensive operations to secure the northern flank of it by forming the front line to allow the Russians to attack the Ukrainian positions from 3 separate directions, from the south, west, and east. In the northern section of the front line here near Chasiv Yar, the Russians have managed to gain control over RUAF, the western parts of it, and the first patch connected to it along the canal. The Russians are here moving alongside the forested areas, gain control over the eastern bank of the canal, with their offensive operations along the first patch to the south of Vovchansk, and now they gain control over the first patch west of RUAF. Russians will be able to gain control over the eastern bank of the canal all the way to the southern flank of Vasilivka. Russians have also made additional advances within the Sumy region and in the Vovchansk direction. In the direction of Vovchansk, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the aggregate plant. At the same time, they are advancing in the northern flank. This is to encircle the Ukrainian forces within the remaining apartment complex buildings, which are the last buildings standing in the northern parts of Vovchansk. This will allow the Russians to gain full control over the northern parts of the Vovcha river line within the town of Vovchansk. Gaining control over this area will allow the Russians to start offensive operations in the southern parts of Vovchansk, or to bypass it completely by moving in the eastern direction. In the Sumy region, the Russians made numerous advances, gaining control over Kostyantynivka in the west, as well as Vodolahy here in the east. With these 2 advances, the Russians have managed to secure an additional crossing across the border area between the Sumy and Kursk regions, where the Russians have started attacking here further west, expanding the front line further to widen the area where the Russians are launching offensive operations and gain control over all the roads leading to Sumy from the north. This is a very interesting development because expanding the front line by widening it further to gain control over all of the roads leading to Sumy may indicate a Russian offensive operation targeting the city itself. This point is not far-fetched. This is based on the fact that the Russians are concentrating troops along the border area. So far, according to the Washington Post, the Russians have concentrated approximately 125,000 soldiers along the border area. According to them, currently 125,000 Russian troops are stationed on the border of Sumy and Kharkiv regions. This article talks about the upcoming Russian summer offensive and the Ukrainians' preparations for it. According to the article that is mainly based on Ukrainian intelligence, the main expected offensive direction of this offensive will be the complete capture of the Donetsk region, according to the analysts in this article. There will be smaller scale attacks along the borders of Sumy and Kharkiv to create a buffer zone. This is what the 125,000 troops are for, while Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk will be the main priority of their offensive. Now, this is very interesting because 125,000 simply to create a buffer zone would mean that the Russians will be expanding the front line beyond what we currently see. The initial push within the Kharkiv region by the Russian forces was used by approximately 10,000 soldiers to capture and hold on to approximately 200 square kilometers of territory. This redirected 40,000 Ukrainian troops to deal with this offensive, as the Russians had 40,000 soldiers in reserve. These were mainly redirected to the Kursk direction, where the Ukrainians sending a large force to deal with the Kharkiv incursion was largely a distraction to cover for the infantry that then moved into the Sumy region to push into the Kursk region. Now we're seeing the Russians concentrating 125,000 soldiers along the border area, which is 12.5 times as many soldiers as were fighting within the Kharkiv region. If we take that as a basis, we can see that the Russians would be able to capture hundreds of square kilometers with these forces on a wide section of the front line, potentially creating a wide but shallow thrust into Ukrainian territory, or launching an offensive operations towards an example Izium or towards the city of Sumy. Sumy is very close to the border area, which means that the Russians would not be putting a lot of risk towards a siege of the city, especially considering it is a city with a pre-war population of about 200 to 300,000 people. And if the Russians ever plan on attacking Kiev again, it is necessary to gain control over Sumy. Sumy region in its entirety is a fairly large region. However, it has a low population. The entire region only has about 2 million people living within it. Despite its large size, this means it's not a very dense position. This also means compared to the Donetsk region, which has approximately 6 million people and is fairly similar in size, is much denser than that of Sumy. There's also not a lot of industry within Sumy. This means that generally the Russians would have a much easier time getting control over such a region in comparison to the Donetsk region. While the Russian main efforts will continue to be the Donetsk region to gain full control over it, the Russians may have plans to gain control over cities such as Sumy, to exchange potentially from Sumy for Kherson if they want to negotiate a peace deal. Sumy is much easier for the Russians to capture than Kherson in the south, where they have to cross over the Dnieper River. At the same time, we could also consider the Russians launching offensive operations towards Izium to hurt the supply lines of the Ukrainians within the Donetsk region and bypass the defenses of the Kostyantynivka line. The Russians have control over much of the eastern bank of the Oska River line. However, they also have a bridgehead across the Oska River line, and with the offensive operations in the Kharkiv region, additional offensive forces crossing over either 50,000 or 75,000 will allow the Russians to launch a large-scale offensive to push all the way down south towards Izium, lining the front line with natural barriers, and securing their flanks for an offensive towards the city, gaining control over which will limit the Ukrainian supplies towards the Kostyantynivka line. Also allow the Russians to gain control over the eastern bank of the Oska River line, freeing up additional forces for further offensive operations in the southern flank of Kharkiv to flank the Donetsk region. Whichever the case, the Russians would be able to completely encircle the Donetsk region by pushing through into the Dnipropetrovsk region and launching offensive operations towards Izium, bypassing the Donetsk region and connecting to the west of the region. There are numerous potential offensives by the Russians. It is completely impossible to guess what they will do because they have such a significant amount of forces in reserve that allows them to launch a completely new offensive from a completely different angle than what we have seen over the past few years since the start of the war. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.